Good morning, y'all. Welcome to Impact and Coffee. I'm Robert Nelson. I'm the program manager for Pivotal New Mexico. Welcome and happy Tuesday, Tuesday the 15th, the day after Valentine's Day. Oh my gosh. I'm joined this morning with my wonderful co-host, Michael Green. Good morning, Michael. How are you today?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We're excited that you're here to help us celebrate Black History Month. For some of those who haven't been to Impact and Coffee before, let me tell you what it is. It's basically an open, welcoming conversation to exchange stories and ideas, foster innovation, to strengthen the nonprofit sector, and to build community. The fancy way of saying we're a nonprofit meetup. We get together 3 times a month, the first 3 Tuesdays of the month. And it's just kind of a way that nonprofits can get together and celebrate successes, talk about struggles, find areas for collaboration, and just a way that we can kind of network within the nonprofit community. So thank you all for joining us today. We're excited for what's going on today. We always like to start off our Impact and Coffees with talking about gratitude, because it is Gratitude Tuesday. So Robert, what are you grateful for these days?
I know this is really strange to say, but I'm grateful for a little bit of warmer weather. I know climate change is bringing this upon us, which is kind of sad, but it is nice to have a sunny day on a February morning. And to be with all of you. So thanks to all the folks who are joining us. I see some regular faces in the audience today. So big thanks to y'all, and big thanks to our Impact and Coffee team as well. Michael, what are you grateful for this morning?
I am grateful for, yeah, I guess the fact that kind of spring is in the air a little bit. Kind of feel it yesterday. Went for a walk in a short sleeve t-shirt, so that was awesome. So kind of right there with you. Sad that we didn't have more of a winter, but I guess we still have a couple of more months, right? Or another month or so. So we'll see. Maybe we'll get some more winter weather. But yeah, I'm grateful for that. Let's see. One other thing that we like to mention here at Impact and Coffee is about our Next Gen In grant. This is a grant that we give to youth who are 25 years old or younger who are trying to build capacity within our nonprofit organization. If you were able to join us last week, we heard from the Food Depot, who is actually a recipient of the Next Gen In grant. So that was pretty cool to actually hear their plan for the $2,500 grant that we give them. So it was great to hear what they're doing in their community and also to help inspire some young leaders. So if you're interested in the Next Gen In grant, you can follow up with any one of the Impact and Coffee planning team, or I'll also drop the link in the chat. We also include a link to it in our weekly newsletter. So yeah, if you know anybody who might be interested, encourage them to fill it out.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And I can't wait to hear from Food Depot once they've implemented their projects. I know it's going to be really cool. So as I said before in the chat, please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, your pronouns, what you're grateful for on this Gratitude Tuesday. And we're going to kick it to Amy here in just a moment, just to introduce herself. I think I somehow have lost her. There she is. Okay, good. Let's see. Amy, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us at Impact and Coffee today. And I hope everyone gives a warm virtual applause for Amy Whitfield this morning. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. I am very excited to be here with y'all today. I have not been to a Coffee and Impact since I left state government to join, or since I left nonprofit world to join state government. And actually, my last presentation when I was the executive director at the Domestic Violence Resource Center was actually Coffee and Impact. And so you guys were a send-off for me to join when I was leaving DVRC to go to CYFD. So very excited to be able to be here with you all and wish that I spent more time with you. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Today, I want to share a little bit of what I know of how New Mexico Black history has come to be and things, people that are very significant within our community, and then also talk to you a little bit about what the Office of African American Affairs does. And so Robert and Michael, I did not prepare for a full hour, so it would be super great if I can just go real quick and then we can have a conversation. I'd love if we could have a conversation about one of the slides that I do have in here. in here. So I'm going to share my screen because, you know, when you're talking about Black history, one of the great things to have is photos, because we're often talking about individual people. And so that's what I wanted to share today, and what I think you all had asked me to really bring. So there we go. So I want to talk a little bit about Black trailblazers in New Mexico, people that we know have been kind of the first here in New Mexico. But I want to start with really saying New Mexico has a very strong history of African American people. And while we don't have a whole lot of conversation about this in our society throughout our state very often, that there is a very long history of African Americans here in New Mexico. It really starts with, you know, some of the first, not to be proud of this, but some of the first conquistadors that came to New Mexico had a lot of more people with them, African people with them as well. And so we do know that that far. We also know that there was a huge group of Buffalo soldiers who came into New Mexico and stayed. And so there's a lot of people who have been here in New Mexico for generations and can trace back Buffalo soldiers as the way that their family and their history came to New Mexico. There's also that there were African Americans who came to New Mexico and settled in order to be farmers. And so we do have the communities of Blackdom and Vado, which were incorporated Black communities. And so those are a huge part of the Black history here in New Mexico. And then finally, we know that as the railroads came through New Mexico, that there were a lot of African Americans who were part of that, part of building the railroads, part of staffing the railroads. And so that a lot of areas here in Albuquerque have strong African American roots and history, and were even created because of the segregation at that time. And so we have very strong community here in New Mexico in history and contributions of Black people in New Mexico. There is an exhibit right now on Black frontiers happening, I think, at the Albuquerque Museum. And so if you're interested in further learning more about this, that is something you can actually go and see. And then I also want to share that there is the African American Museum and Cultural Center, which is a nonprofit here in New Mexico that is doing a really great job of making sure that people know about the African American roots here in New Mexico. But often during Black History Month, what we want to do is we want to celebrate those people who have been first. And so I really want to share with you all some of the Black trailblazers in New Mexico. First, I want to share Lanjour Abu Kusumo, right, who was our first Black fire chief here in New Mexico. You know, one of the things that when I look at some of these firsts in New Mexico, that often folks do not look that old to me, right? Many of them look, you know, the age of my parents. And so it's often amazing to me when we say that they are the first, and what that really means about equity and inclusion throughout our state. Ed Corley Sr., who was the first Black-owned car dealership, right? And still you can see that car dealership here in Albuquerque if you're, you know, driving down, I guess, up I-25. And then there are also locations in Gallup. And they are, you know, grown and grown and grown. And so now Ed Corley's children also have dealerships as well. Fred Henry, who we weren't actually able to find a photo for, and I'm very sorry for that. He was the first Black UNM football player to be drafted to a professional team. He ended up playing for the Rams. Unfortunately, he died at a very young age. He died at the age of 44. And so, you know, way after his football career, but another person that we at UNM are very proud of and also proud of here in New Mexico. Loretta Loftus was the first Black teacher hired in the Albuquerque public school system. Linton Mallory, a person I actually had the pleasure of meeting. He was the first Black principal here in New Mexico, and was the first Black state representative elected. Rutha Owens was the first Black woman principal in the Albuquerque public schools. Many of you know James Lewis, right? He's someone who is still extremely active in our community, he's had more than 40 years of service in state government and local government and federal government, right? Currently, I think he's still working in the Keller administration. I'm not sure, he may have passed from that position. But, he was our first Black statewide elected official as state treasurer, was also the city manager for Albuquerque, has done tons of other things in government. Many of you may know Jane Padrell, who was the first Black representative from Corrales, also our first Republican Black representative. Gerald Byers, who was just elected in this past election as the first district attorney of Doña Ana County. Something that we really want to highlight is that, African Americans do not just live in Albuquerque here in New Mexico, right? While Albuquerque may have the highest numbers, Lee County in the Hobbs area has the highest percentage of African Americans. And then there's also a pretty high percentage of African Americans in Doña Ana County or Las Cruces, also in Alamogordo, Santa Fe, Rio Rancho. African Americans are prominent throughout the state. Shamara Henderson was the first Black woman elected statewide, and she currently sits on the New Mexico Court of Appeals, and again, just elected this last election. And so, again, when we talk about the first at this time, when it is, just a very, it was just a short time ago, we do have to wonder why we're still having these firsts. Oh, I lost my thing. Okay, and Harold Pope, who is the first Black elected senator, again, elected in this last go round of elections. Very excited to have him in office, and he has been really connecting with the African American community office, also a veteran, someone who's very committed to our community, committed to New Mexico overall. So I want to talk a little bit, and hopefully I'm asking if maybe I can save this and then share a little bit about OOAA, and then maybe turn this slide into the conversation that we can have. The picture that you have here is Miss Deborah Johns. She is one of the leaders in the African American community. She just passed away in December, and is really, really greatly missed by our community. And the reason I've elected to put her there as a photo is that her commitment, she will probably never be remembered as a first. She will probably not, as history goes by, be, a picture in presentations and things like this, but that her commitment was to uplifting others. Her commitment was to making sure that there were people who had voices at the table. Her commitment was to talking about young people and letting them know how much they could be anything that they wanted to be and strive for all the things that they wanted to do. And while she's not the only person in our community who does this, she was just really on my heart to share her photo as we had this conversation, because very often we talk about diversity and we talk about first during Black History Month, and we forget that a lot of those firsts were alone, right? Very much alone. And that as we move from diversity towards equity and inclusion, that the idea is not to have one person be the first and one person be there, but that it's really about having an inclusive space, that anyone who wants to be there has the ability to be there, and to be there like at the table, to be hired, to be put into leadership. And that as much as we've had first, both here in New Mexico and in our nation, that we're still not changing the statistics on what is considered normal, right? That we have had, nationally, we've had a Black president. Nationally, we've had Black men and Black women run Fortune 100 companies. And yet when we look at the statistics for people of color in leadership, those numbers are still extremely small. And that is true not just in our government and in our for-profit companies, it's extremely true in our nonprofits as well, is that Black leadership in nonprofits is often very, very low in statistics, but then it's often only given at times when we call it the glass cliff, right? And so that we take a chance on Black and Indigenous people when it's kind of like, well, we're at our end, let's go ahead and take a chance on them. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about what the Office of African American Affairs does, but I hope that we can come back and have this conversation because there's been a huge call for diversity and equity and inclusion. And that's a great call to have, but that what we often do is that we get to that space of diversity and then we stop, right? Or what we do is we create spaces that are affinity spaces for people of color, and that doesn't necessarily create equity and inclusion either, although those spaces are necessary as well. So to tell you a little bit about the Office of African American Affairs and what we do, one of the things that we're real focused on is making sure that we are communicating in a way that highlights the African American community in New Mexico. There are so many contributions that African Americans have made and do make here in New Mexico, and there isn't really a space to highlight that, so that we do that in our office. Some of the ways that you can see that is that we have a podcast called Re-Educated. It really highlights young people and what young people are interested in doing so that they can be a part of movements that are happening here in New Mexico, primarily social justice movements. We also have the Deep Bench, which highlights every month 3 African Americans who are prominent in their field and ready for the next step in leadership. And then we have the Pillars, which is we feature different people throughout the community writing articles about education, economics, or health, which are our 3 pillar areas. And then we do a weekly article that boils down issues, really complex issues, to have conversations in a 3-minute read, maybe a 5-minute read that are specific to African American experiences. We have a data hub on our website. This data hub really looks at those lived experiences of African Americans here in New Mexico, making sure that, very often when we hear about statistics in New Mexico for Blacks, we hear that, oh, we cannot get those statistics because it is, statistically insignificant is the words that I hear very often. And so we're making a huge effort on our website to make sure that those statistics about African Americans and the experiences that they have here in New Mexico are being published on our website. And then we do events that are specific to the voices of African Americans. We highlight African Americans as speakers. We highlight those issues that are important to our community. And we make sure that we're speaking out in bold voices that sometimes in other spaces we're not allowed to have. And we do capacity building programs, making sure that we're having specific cultural relevance to African Americans, making sure that it is things that are created by African American people for African American people, and so that we can have conversations about why it might be different. One of the things that you see here is the New Mexico Black Challenge Accepted that we just started here in 2022 that really focuses on outdoor space. And, one of the big jokes is that there really isn't a lot of African Americans in outdoor spaces, right? Doing hiking and biking and camping and those kinds of things. But that our history really says that that's who we were a long time ago, but that because of violence towards us and segregation and the way that economics have really taken over the outdoor space, is that the outdoor space has been denied to us, even though historically is something that we were highly contributing to, both in being involved with it as a recreation, but also in the creation of national parks and state parks. And so we're really making an effort to get people more involved in the outdoor spaces and really, I guess, reclaiming that history of ours. So that really gives kind of an overview of what we do and who we are, and just a little bit more about the Office of African American Affairs, and a little bit of history about African Americans here in New Mexico. So would love to turn it back to you, Michael and Robert, and see what would be kind of the best way to move forward, if there's any thoughts or questions or conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Amy, for sharing that. I think the Black Trailblazers that you started out with was, I mean, super interesting because, I mean, I know that I don't have much knowledge of the Black Trailblazers in the state. So hearing that was pretty cool. So I thank you for that. I think maybe the best way we could do this is do some Q&A, and then we can go back to that slide that you wanted to have a conversation with, just so we can kind of keep that momentum going from your presentation and kind of move forward. So yeah, thank you again for that. So let's see, I guess we can start off with something like, where do you see the Office of African American Affairs in the next like 5 years or so? What kind of growth do you see for you all?
Wow, right? Like there's the vision, there's the dream. So I think, you know, we are a state office, so that as a state office, we're kind of limited to what the legislature sees as fit to fund us, or we can seek funding from federal government. We can seek funding from philanthropic areas, but that, you know, it has to run in a different way. It doesn't necessarily run through the office. And so growth is really around policy development, right? Like if the Office of African American Affairs is going to get larger, it's going to do that based on policies. And so there are so many different policies. You know, our mission is improving the lives of African Americans. And I think there are multiple different policies where we can do that. Last year in the 2021 session, we passed the Black Education Act. We, the legislature, I'm not responsible for passing anything. So the legislature passed the Black Education Act, which created a policy that is highly focused on making sure that African American students and the gap that we have, the disparities that we have between African American success and white success is closed. And so that policy is has, you know, it's increasing, and this is a very small number, but that means there are 4 people over in the public education department that are just focused on that, right? And so I guess that's to say the Office of African American Affairs doesn't need to grow at all, as long as we are instituting policy that the other state agencies are focused on. And so for us in this administration, what I'm focusing on is workforce development. I really think that we need to be highly focused on making sure that African Americans have the same workforce development opportunities, and that we close that gap. So I'd love to see the Department of Workforce Solutions end up with a African American specific team. And I think, right, like it has to, you know, very often we talk about, well, if we give money to Department of Workforce Solutions for, you know, money for everyone to increase the workforce, that doesn't necessarily work, right? Is because you need to have solutions that are about where people are at. And if there's already a gap, well, you're not meeting people where they're at if you do the same thing for everyone. So I would like to see a department or a program or a unit or something like that over at the Department of Workforce Solutions that's highly focused on positions that are dying out, right? You know, Robert, you mentioned earlier climate change. So we know we have to do some different things about our climate, and that means that there are going to be positions that are dying out. And so as those positions are dying out, we need to be creating replacement positions, and we need to make a priority that Black and Indigenous people are being put into those kinds of training academies for those replacement positions. I would also like to see in Workforce Solutions something that is highly focused on layoffs, right? That we know very much that when layoffs happen, it's usually African Americans and here in New Mexico, Indigenous people who are laid off first. And that often happens because we have this kind of, well, last one in, first one out when it's laid off. Well, last one in is usually a person of color, right? And so we need to have some very significant ways to stop that from happening. When we have something like a pandemic or a recession or anything like that, it should not be Black and Indigenous people who suffer the most in those times. The other thing I really want to see for the Office of African American Affairs is I want to see some opportunities that aren't necessarily connected to education, right? That we often, we as a state and as a nation have been really talking to people and saying college is the only way to succeed. And that, we've been opening up tons and tons of opportunities for people to go to college. But we also know that if you weren't treated all that great in high school, why would you go to college, right? Why would you see the opportunity as a great opportunity? Also, if you weren't treated all that well in high school and you're part of this, what they call the school to prison pipeline, right? That those opportunities for college often, they miss you. And so I would love to see a lot more work being done on creating opportunities for people who don't necessarily want to go to college, or that's not the immediate route for them to be able to take. So again, I'd love to grow something in either the higher education department or maybe public education department, or even workforce solutions that's really focused on apprenticeships, really focused on making sure that I keep saying Black and Indigenous, and I want to be really clear why I'm saying Black and Indigenous, is that we have similar lived experiences, right? While the history that we have is not the same, the results of that history is the same. And that I am not leaving out other people of color. I think, we need to have focus on other people of color as well. But that when you talk about the impact of racism and the impact of the genocide that was done on Indigenous communities, is that the impact of that today in America is very similar. It's very similar. And so that if we're actually going to move towards equity and inclusion, that we have to be creating programs that are specifically tailored towards Black and Indigenous communities, and building those communities up in a real way. And so whenever I have ideas about what we should do for African Americans, I'm totally, I want to be inclusive of Indigenous communities as well, because I know that those communities are facing the exact same impact of history that we're facing. And then there are some times when we should be separate as well, right? So I'm sorry, that was a big, long talk about what I want. But those are the things that I want to see in the next 5 years for the Office of African American Affairs, is that I don't necessarily need to grow OOAA. I need to grow programs that are specific to our community and culturally relevant for our community, right? Is that, and I'll talk about this when we move to the conversation about switching diversity to equity and inclusion, but that so many of the programs that we have that are tailored towards uplifting African American communities are not actually uplifting African American communities. They're very damaging to us, and so we can talk about that later. Thanks for that question, though.
Yeah, thank you for all of that information. And I think, yeah, that's a good plan that you have to, like you said, not necessarily grow the Office of African American Affairs, but grow other programming. So I appreciate that response. There was a question that was dropped in the chat, and it was from Jermaine, and it says, would the Office of African American Affairs consider producing an annual New Mexico Trailblazers calendar? So.
Wow, Jermaine, that is a great idea. It is not one that I had considered. Certainly we can consider it. One of the things that we're working on right now is creating an African American specific magazine for New Mexico, right? We think that is the next stage of our communication. And I think a Trailblazers calendar within that digital magazine would be a great idea. Thanks for that. I'm totally stealing it.
Thank you for that, Jermaine. Are there any questions in the audience? Feel free to either unmute yourselves or type it in the chat. Either way, we can those questions to Amy. Robert, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like we're entering the third year of the pandemic. Oh my God. And I was just wondering, like, so how did operations for y'all shift in the last 2.5 years?
Completely, totally, 100%, right? That the Office of African American Affairs is a highly community-based office, right? That, we were formed in 1999, and our first executive director, who actually just passed away last week, was real famous for saying that the first thing he did when he became the director was to get in his beat up old Toyota truck and drive the state to meet African Americans and communicate with them. And so that's how we started, and that is our history. So we were very highly engaged in community, being out in the community, holding events in the community, and in a pandemic, particularly in a pandemic that hits African Americans at a much higher rate, you have to not do those things, right? You have to, for the safety of our community and the safety of my staff, not be out, right? Not be in the community as much. One of the things that we really did is we moved everything virtual. And so it's actually been a way for us to reach more people. Oh my goodness. My Roomba just started. I'm sorry. So if you hear my vacuum, I'm sorry. That's what happened. So we've gone virtual. We've done just about everything virtual. And it's really been a great way for us to be able to include people throughout the state at the same time, right? Instead of having an event in Clovis, we can now have an event that includes Clovis and Albuquerque and Hobbs and Las Cruces and all of that together. So that has been actually really wonderful, and I think has created an even larger African American community for us to interact with. But at the same time, it is difficult because we are, there's some hesitation to be who you really are in a recorded space, right? In a virtual space. And that even when the event is not recorded, there's still some hesitancy to be, to be as bold and as true to difficult conversations as you want to be. So that's been a difficulty for us, but we're continuing to do things virtually, and we're continuing to have our events and our capacity building projects. I think one of the things that it has opened up the door for us is to engage in politics and state government in other ways, right? And so things that we probably in the past weren't introduced into or weren't included in, when it's Zoom, you can't exactly, right? You put out the information and now I know where to go and I know how to get there. And so our voice has been a little bit more included during the pandemic than it has been in the past.
Thanks for that, Amy. If anyone has any other questions, you're welcome to drop them in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute them too.
Hi, Amy. Hi, guys. I'm Trish Lopez. I run Teen Years, which is tech-savvy teens helping senior citizens learn technology through one-on-one coaching. So there's a few things I wanted to say to what Amy said. Regarding the hiking and outdoor stuff, I can totally relate. I was born and raised in Belen. We had no money. And my brothers and I, there's 5 of us, we talked in our 20s about like I started dating dating a white guy who had money, who wasn't from Belen. And he was like taking me on all these hiking and camping trips. And I'm like telling my brothers, did you know there's this place, this beautiful place, Tent Rocks, New Mexico? And let me tell you about it. And all of us were just like, why do we not know about this stuff? And, one of my brothers pointed out, like when we did go out, he's like, why is it only white people here? And this is, of course, nothing against white people. To me, it's a classism issue just as much as a black-white issue. So I'm always very big on saying classism is what makes ageism, sexism, racism, all that flourish. And I really recognize that more with my very dark-skinned father and light-skinned mother. And so I just wanted you to know I could relate to that too. So I'm glad that you guys are thinking about that, because I wish there would have been some kind of programs for us growing up about being outdoors. And now trying to teach my daughter how to be outdoors has been its own challenge, because I'm like, I really don't have this experience, but I want to take her out so that she feels more of a comfort level than I did. I wanted to thank you for some of the things you shared with us, like the Re-Educated podcast I had not heard about. And so I'm excited to learn about that. So teen years, I've reached out to the Office of African American Affairs several times over the last few years, hoping we could get some young men from your community as teen years. And I've never connected with anyone. So I would love to get your thoughts in the chat, or however I can give you my email, about who is best to connect with in terms of recruiting young Black men that might be interested in doing this. It's basically tutoring. It's not like a job that's going to pay the bills. It's geared towards high school and college students. But it's a fantastic way to build your resume if you're a young person, to develop great interpersonal communication skills, and really build your self-esteem. We have kids from all walks of life, from public schools, private schools, home schools, charter schools, it's endless the amount of benefits they get from the work. So I would love to hear your thoughts on who to connect with.
Yeah, so I think I would be the person to connect with. But I think, so I want to say something about classism, right? Is that I think you're absolutely right, is that, classism really highlights all of the difference in things that we have, and so when we're talking about hiking and camping and those things, is that classism is part of it, but I think also that we have to remember historically that there was a huge push to keep people out, right? And that push was violence, right? And so that there's a generational feeling that, like, no, this isn't for you. And the reason it's not for you is because of the violence and the segregation from history. And that also, when you're talking about classism, it then becomes, well, what do you spend your money on, right? So if I'm too poor to go camping and hiking and all of those things, we often spend money on recreation. And so that we have to make decisions about what we spend our money on. So the thing where there's a history of being violent and violated, right? And so people who don't have money to do all things are going to not choose the outdoors because they have stories of not just great grandmothers, but stories of mothers who were told and taught, you're not supposed to go here. And then I think that really translates into what you do. And so that very often when we're talking about young people, and I don't know if this is true, and I'd have to look at statistics and things like that to be real clear, but that very often when we're talking about things like knowing how to run computers and being able to teach that, is that what young people with lower economic status, that they don't necessarily feel all that confident in their own abilities, right? And that is because, classism has meant that there's not 6 laptops in your home, everyone's got one. And so it's really easy for you to feel like, well, I can teach an older generation how to use computers because I grew up on computers, right? That if you're talking about young African-American males, they may not have grown up on laptops and computers. They may have grown up on cell phones, right? And that they have done their homework and their communication and everything on a cell phone, and may not feel the kind of confidence that it would be to say, I can come and teach an older generation or work with an older generation in that way. So we may want to talk more about how do we recruit in a way that boosts up their own confidence or abilities to do that. Or you may already be doing that. I'm not sure.
Really, we've had African-American young people work for us. So it's really about getting the word out. Beverly Jordan was the last person I kept writing, being like, can we schedule a meeting? And it's not like we're recruiting dozens. We're a small organization, but just getting the word out and having that contact with the office would be awesome. So I'll email you. I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah. So, and Beverly Jordan is with the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission.
Yeah, I see that she moved now, and I'm wondering why she didn't let me know because I'm like, so just waiting to hear back, really. But I'm glad that you're on the call now, because now we'll make a connection.
Yeah, for sure. Please send me anything.
All right, Amy, we have another question in the chat, and it says, it's from Lori. It says, this year's theme for Black History Month is health and wellness. As a housing provider, we know there is a direct correlation between housing and health. How does your office address the disparities in healthcare and housing for the Black communities?
Yeah. So again, it's not one of our pillar areas. Housing is not one of our pillar areas. Health is one of our pillar areas, but we haven't connected those two things within our office, right? However, one of the things that I think is really important is for us to be having conversations around just exactly how housing has been denied to African Americans historically, right? So you can go all the way back, well, not all the way back, like it's not that far, but you know, when we're talking about how did white wealth get created and built, and that really has been around housing, and that it really started with, you know, the ability to buy a house that was not allowed to African Americans, right? So African Americans weren't allowed to have, you know, loans. They weren't seen as good investments. So when they did get loans, they got subprime loans. There were certain areas that they weren't allowed to buy houses in that were then, you know, the property values skyrocketed in those areas versus the areas where African Americans were allowed to buy housing. Even here in New Mexico, there are certain neighborhoods down by the rail yards in Albuquerque that are, right, like this is where Black people were allowed to live. And so there's, you know, there's all of that around housing and how African Americans have been denied that housing. But now we have these issues now where it's not really, you know, it isn't said, well, you can't buy these houses. It's very subtle. There was a story that I read maybe a year or two ago about a Black woman who was trying to sell her house, and they kept giving her a very low, what's the word? They were rating her house as very low, like maybe like $400,000, $500,000 it's worth, where all the other houses in the neighborhood were going for like $1 million. And that she basically changed all the pictures in her house to her husband's, she was married to a white man, to her husband's family. And so all the pictures in her house were white. And then she had her husband go to the meeting by himself, and then they gave him $1 million as the estimate on what the house was worth, right? And so, you know, it's like, okay, well, those things are happening still today, and so we're still doing things that stop African American people from having positive housing, and then also things like, you know, having to check on a box whether or not you have a criminal record as a way to get into an apartment. Those things are stopping African American people from having housing. So Lori, thanks for the question. I'm sorry the Office of African American Affairs isn't doing anything on it, but it is something that we talk about quite often. It's something that we explore in our Black Thought Expo when we have that once a year. Because they're highly correlated. Housing and health are highly correlated. And there's still a huge disparity between African Americans and white people around housing access. So it's definitely something we pursue, we just don't have any programs around it.
All right, thank you for that, Amy. With about 17 minutes left, I think this could be a good opportunity to go to the slide that you wanted to discuss, and then with a couple minutes at the end, we can ask you the last couple of questions you usually do. Does that sound like a good plan?
Sure, absolutely, right. I mean, I don't know if we need my whole slide, but I will share it again. Maybe if I can get there, yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that I just really want to share is that I've seen such an interest. There are so many allies in New Mexico that want to make sure that we are creating space, that we're opening up the opportunities for Black and Indigenous and other people of color to really have programs that are focused on building up youth. But one of the reasons why I say that that's really diversity, and it isn't, the whole phrase is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sometimes people put justice into that, is that I think that we have a problem because we focus on that diversity aspect and we forget that programs should meet people where they're at and create pride and create power, right? That these programs should empower people, but that very often what we do is we focus on youth. And because we focus on youth, we leave out their parents and their grandparents and their aunties and their uncles and all of those things. And that what we actually inadvertently tell young people is that in order to be successful, you should leave your community behind, right? Or we make them not proud of their community because we say, come over here, from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, you're going to talk about these things that your parents and your grandparents and your aunties and your uncles and all of those folks aren't talking about. And this is the good stuff, right? And so I think that, if we really want to move past diversity and start talking about equity and inclusion, that means we have to be multi-generational. And it means that we have to care about uplifting adults as much as we care about uplifting youth, right? And then the other thing is that I think it's really about power and empowering, right? And that if we really want to create programs that are about that those programs should be connected to giving young people feelings or, adult people, when we're creating this space, giving them the feeling that they have the power rather than feeling that they're coming from a deficit, right? Making sure that they're engaging in what we use the model of community cultural wealth that was created by Tara Yasso. And so that really is saying that, when you do programs, that those programs should connect as much to the strengths of the African-American community as much as it's talking about whatever you're doing, right? So if you're doing a STEM program, as much as you're having conversations about science and technology, you should be having conversations about how African-Americans contributed to the science and technology, right? Being connected there to that history. Or you should be doing it as much as talking about how families can benefit from science and technology. If you're doing a program that's about sports and engaging children in healthy sports or healthy nutrition or anything like that, again, you want to make sure that they're feeling empowered by that and not feeling like they're coming from a space of deficits. So, yeah. That's my thought. I welcome anybody else's thoughts. Can I take myself off the spotlight? Is that
I can do it for you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, let's see, that should have worked. Yes. Does anybody have any comments or opinions?
It's great to have you ladies here today. I like how there's already staff following up with me on the call, so thank you so much.
Hi, Amy. It's Jermaine. Thank you again for being here. I have a question. When you speak of instilling pride in New Mexico's African American children, reminding them that this is a very cultural and rich and enriching place to even be. Are you having any cooperation with the school systems with sharing that message?
Well, let me first give the caveat that, I have been, the entire time I've been at the Office of African American Affairs has been the pandemic, right? So the schools don't necessarily have as much opportunity to engage with us as maybe they have in the past. My experience, though, and it's it's not just my experience with schools, but it's my experience with, you know, program creators in general, is that they want to make an all size fits, right? And that we often use the excuse, I call it an excuse, they would probably call it policy, that, you know, you can't give one kid something that you don't give all kids the opportunity to have, right? And so that there is such a hesitancy to have anything that is specific for Black children, right? They want to be able to say, well, you know, we're going to do this event and, you know, but anyone can come. And it's fine for anyone to come, but you have to create spaces that are for Black children, right? Black children have been treated in very different ways. And so they don't feel as comfortable in what we would call dominant culture spaces. And so I have a really hard time working with other groups in general, right? Both school systems and other systems, because they all want to say, well, it's for everybody. And when it's for everybody, then it is really only for dominant culture, because that's the culture that we go to all the time, right? And so I think one example of that is the ethnic studies bill that was, you know, in legislative session in 2021, right? And so very often they kept saying, you know, oh, we want to pass this ethnic studies bill where it's going to be required that, you know, kids in high school, and I think it was like elementary all the way to high school, we're going to get some ethnic studies, you know, information, education. But and I don't think that anybody who said this would say that they were opposed to ethnic studies, but they kept saying over and over and over again, well, we just need to have, you know, something that everyone, that we can all have, right? Like, we don't want to put people into separate spaces. And it was like, okay, but if you don't create separate spaces, then you're not creating safe spaces, right? You're not creating spaces of pride and spaces of empowerment. And so I don't, like, I'm not trying to say the schools suck and we should all, you know, be angry at them. I'm just trying to say that there is a real hesitancy towards that equity and inclusion piece, because we want to keep doing the diversities piece, right? We want to keep saying, well, you know, we'll do diversity, which means make sure that you spend a lot of time putting Black people on the brochures, without actually creating the spaces of equity and inclusion where Black people feel 100% included and safe and empowered. Thanks, Jermaine.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that distinction, Amy. I know I struggle with that too, knowing it's like, oh, we need to continue to build diversity. And it's like, well, you keep on inviting people to the table, but you never allow the folks that are invited to the table to set the table in any way, shape, or form, or make decisions about who gets to come to the table or anything. And so, yeah, I think especially when it comes to schools, it's like how, and any system that we're talking about, whether it's housing or healthcare or energy or any like that, or environment or anything like that, it's like, oh, none of the folks that we talk about in terms of diversifying said table get to make decisions about that. And it's like, you know, what can we do to move beyond just diversity and go into equity and inclusion, and even towards justice? Because I think that's oftentimes a different conversation altogether, and it's often lumped in. So like, could you talk a little bit more about like how, you know, like building power really kind of affects how that movement will happen, that transition will happen?
Yeah, well, and I think, so this is why I want the Office of African American Affairs to focus so much on workforce development, is that when we talk about, I think the school systems are a really great example, because when we talk about Black history, no one can say that one of the greatest things of progress in Black history was the desegregation of schools, right? You know, Brown versus the Board of Education is highly touted as one of the greatest things to happen for African Americans in our nation, right? But that the unintended impact of that was that so many of our Black community leaders who were principals and teachers and all of that were basically kicked out of the job force. Or put into highly unsuccessful schools. And so what that did is it started moving African-American students into schools that were more resourced, but at the same time, it stopped them from having that power connection of seeing people, of being in spaces where they were appreciated and loved and connected, all for the resource. And so I think that the number one thing to do is, as we start talking about sharing resources, that the first thing that we have to share is make sure that our workforce has as many BIPOC leaders as anything else, right? And again, I go to this multi-generational thing. If you're going to create spaces and say that you really truly want to create change, and that you're just starting with youth and doing that with just youth, you're creating youth who leave their communities, right? We talk about it as brain drain all the time. You're creating youth that leave their communities rather than creating a multi-generational healing of communities. So I think that's the first thing is, for every dollar, and this would be my guide to philanthropy, right? For every dollar that you give to a youth organization, that you have to invest just as much money in an adult serving organization, right? Or for every dollar that you give a youth serving organization, you have that youth serving organization put $1 into the family, right? That would be kind of one of the things that I think you do. The other is that I really think that one of the things that we talk about a lot, when I went to grad school, I had the exciting but also very challenging practicum internship of running a youth-led youth group, right? And so when I say running, what that was, and this was the rule, and it was exactly what was given to me, you're here to make sure that if there's an emergency, there's an adult present. Other than that, you don't get to say anything. These youth run this. And while I was sitting there saying what we really need in this community, we're building a community center. What we really need in this community center is tutoring and, opportunities for you to, get college SAT tutoring. And, I was all about like college. And those kids kept saying, no, Miss Whitfield, we ain't doing that. We're going to have a boxing gym. And they just kept saying a boxing gym. And I was like, are you kidding? We're not doing a boxing gym. And it didn't matter what I said. They got to lead it. And that was so hard for me, right? And, I was 25 at the time. It was so extremely hard for me to sit back and say, all right, I guess we're going for a boxing gym, And so I think about that feeling that I had when I had to let teens decide what they were going to do and go for it. We have to do that same thing in dominant culture, right? Is that folks have to say, if we really truly care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have to sit down, shut up, and let other people who are most impacted by these decisions run, right? And if it's not what I want, and if it's not what the grant said we're supposed to do, and if it's not this and it's not that, doesn't matter. Not your voice that is important. But I think that the biggest problem we have is that we do not run programs based on a community voice. We don't even run programs on based what our own voice is. We run programs based on what a grant funder said they want to support, right? And so that if you are a tutoring program, or if you get a tutoring grant, then tutoring is what you do, right? You don't usually get to have people say, well, we don't want to do tutoring, we want to do boxing, because we fund on singular issues, but life happens in multi-dimensional ways. And so I think we do funding wrong, and that's a much bigger conversation.
But it's a great reminder for everyone to talk to funders that way. I feel blessed that most of the funding Teen Years gets, they don't tell me how to spend it. And I really prioritize letting our work speak for itself so that the funders come to me rather than me constantly spending my time applying to grants. But yeah, it's so much work, and I totally agree with you. I love that story that you just shared. That's so true. And then this because the ageism is a thing too. And so I was just talking to Verizon recently, who had offered us money, and they met with me and many others, or like 4 other organizations, all youth organizations. And they're like, so we're really excited about what you're doing. Did you know youth don't have broadband in different areas? And I'm like, did you know that seniors have not had broadband in so many areas for so long? There are so many programs for youth, which we need, but people forget about adults. People forget about adults that want to switch careers, and older adults that are completely isolated in society. And so it's a great story. I liked that a lot.
I appreciate that, Trish, and I appreciate that, Amy, too, especially talking about that particular facet of how we develop youth in our community. It's very extractive. It's just another form of an extractive industry in our, in our state more than anything. I know it's 9:59 and we're about to round out to 10 o'clock, but Amy, you've talked about a lot of stuff, but I'll ask this one last question, which is, what can our community do for you today?
So the Coffee and Impact community, is that the question? Okay, so the Coffee and Impact community, I think, the Office of African American Affairs has a very wishy-washy thing going on, right? Because we're a state government agency that's super, super small, and we don't necessarily have a state mandate, right? Like CYFD is mandated to protect children, and so they've got like a very system that does that, but the Office of African American Affairs doesn't do that. So very often we run as a nonprofit would, right? So what I think the Coffee and Impact community can do for the Office of African American Affairs is really engage so that we get a African American nonprofit, right? That I think would be the most and we've got some, right, that are being built. But very often what happens is when they're talking to funders, people will say, well, we can't fund you because we already fund this nonprofit over here who's serving everybody, right? So that's what I would ask, is that you all be a voice, that there should be a very specific nonprofit that is working towards the development of African American people in our state.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. I appreciate it. Everyone, please give a round of applause for Amy Whitfield. We appreciate you being here this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time today and for having this very, very robust conversation. So that does it for Impacting Coffee for the month of February. So we'll be back in March. I believe it's March 1st, actually, which is a Tuesday. And we haven't decided on programming just yet, so keep an eye out for that. Just also a heads up too, we're actually going to be conducting a bit of a community survey too, so we'll be passing it out to regular attendees, nonprofits we've reached out to before, just to kind of ask, like, what are some things that you'd like to see more out of Impacting Coffee as we complete our 6th year, entering in our 6th year of this event. And so just would love to know, like, what folks are thinking about, what folks need from us in a lot of ways. But and I know Deshaun just asked, Amy, do you have a connection with the military there? That was my first understanding of Afro-Americans here. Amy, if you could leave your, I know you did before, but if you could leave your email and phone number, that'd be really great. And we make sure that we can follow up and connect y'all as best as we can. And that's it for Impacting Coffee, y'all. I hope everyone has a really great Tuesday and a really great rest of your month. And we will see you very soon. Take care, y'all.